Good morning, our viewers. Welcome to the 27th episode of Strategically Speaking with Dr. Adityanjee, a feature of Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs is a think tank registered in United States and focused on international issues, specifically Indo-Pacific issues. In the 27th episode today, we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Sukh Deo Muni. Professor Sukh Deo Muni is Professor Emeritus at Jawaharlal Nehru University and School of International Studies. During his academic career, he has taught in several universities, including University of Rajasthan and National University of Singapore. Now, to top that up, not only he is an academic, he is also a quote-unquote practitioner of diplomacy. In diplomatic jargon, we kind of divide into practitioners versus academics. He's both. He has had several diplomatic assignments appointed by Government of India in various countries and international organizations. He has been member of several security-related committees and boards in India, and he received Sri Lanka Ratna, the highest civilian national award in Sri Lanka. We welcome Professor Sukh Deo Muni to our platform. The topic of today's discussion would be political instability in Nepal, and there cannot be any better person to discuss this than Professor Muni, because he is a most credible domain expert on Nepal. So welcome to you, our program, sir. Welcome to CSA.
Thank you.
So as we know, Nepal has been mired with political instability, leading to another new government formation very recently under KP Sharma Oli. What is going on in Nepal since it's adopted the current constitution in 2015?
Well, what is going on Nepal is extremely difficult to describe in one or two sentences. But it certainly, as you said very rightly, it is a dance of political instability and circulation of elites. Actually, after the elimination of monarchy, and I would say even before that, hardly any government had survived for its full term. And earlier it was decided by the monarch. Now I think the power equations are not settling properly, because they every time have a what you call a power sharing arrangement. It breaks in between, because the next person who is aspiring to take over the baton from the other in terms of power sharing doesn't get it, and the one who is in power either dissolves the parliament or changes the equations in one way or the other. As you saw, even the previous one, Prachanda, had an alliance with Oli, he had an alliance with Devpa, and again he was going to have another alliance with Devba. At that time, Oli intervened and got an alliance done with the Nepali Congress Party, Devba. And this is how the real crux of the problem is the power struggle and love for power. I cannot describe in any other way. All other rhetorics about nation building, state building are secondary to it. The first priority is that they must remain in power. And since the democracy has opened up aspirations of people, and there are so many people who are competing for the top job and competing for control over the state power, struggle against each other, and try to oversmart each other. I mean, that is exactly the game which has been going on. But at the same time, one must say that after the elimination of monarchy, we see in Nepal a very inclusive system comparatively. We see people who are far more confident, far more aspirant. They are working hard. In fact, many more Nepalese are leaving Nepal and going out for jobs because they are aspiring section of the people. The demography, which has changed in a way where you have a huge youth bulge, and that cannot be accommodated in the poor economy, which is being run under the umbrella of these political instability, in which nobody is really emphasizing the developmental course. But the people are there and pressure, and I'm quite hopeful that it is a new nascent democracy. It is only about 20 years old, roughly less than 20 years old. It will take time. No democracy is stabilized in such a short time. So while it is a period of dismay, disappointment, I'm quite hopeful that Nepal would get on its rails eventually. It will take maybe a decade more, but then it would have it has the energy and to some extent even resources, particularly tourism, hydropower, that it would spring into development and progress.
How far the 2015 constitution is helping, how far the constitution of 2015 is going to fulfill the aspirations of Nepalese population. It was thought to be very, facilitative, but lately there have been critiques of the 2015 constitution as being more regressive than even the interim constitution.
No, I would not say that it is more retrograde than the interim constitution, but it is true that the aspirations which were built into the interim constitution were not fully realized because the dominant section of the society, which is led by Khas Arya community, which is largely the mid-hill people livers, they still had a lot of hesitation and reservation on accommodating and taking on board two other communities. One is the tribal groups, the second one is the Tarai people. And as a result, the constitution shows a very clear tilt where the demands and aspirations of the tribal groups, as also the Madhesh Tarai people, have not been accommodated fully. Either in terms of federalism, the constitution is federal now. The state is being run in a federal manner, but not the federal manner which the Madhesh or the Janjatis would have wanted to have it that way. So the constitution, I would say, has met halfway through the aspirations which were unleashed in 2006, 2008, when the interim constitution was brought into being and the monarchy was eliminated. The Maoist insurgency was mainstream because it was, but that again itself, Doctor, was a real achievement of a country like Nepal, because look at the world around. How many insurgencies have been peacefully incorporated into a democratic system? And I'm sure that any such development, if it would have taken place in Europe or anywhere else in the West, they must have bagged at least half a dozen Nobel Prizes. But this is a development of massive significance, I would call it. But democracy is not stabilized, and it is not as inclusive as it had been wanted to. But it is a major step, and I hope that eventually constitutional clauses would be amended to accommodate whatever has remained. In fact, this present government which has come to power on a slogan. I would say slogan because I don't know how seriously they mean it, on a slogan of changing the constitution. But changing the constitution in what direction is not defined. Therefore, expectations are that it should be an inclusive constitution. But everybody is keeping fingers crossed. I am also keeping fingers crossed because the dominant community has not given up on its right to control the state.
So the 2015 constitution changed Nepal from a unitary state to a federal state. But the way 7 provinces were created left a lot to be desired. It did not satisfy the aspirations of Madhesi people. Was
That's
it
very
a
true. That's
clever
very true.
trick done by the Nepal's ruling elites to do lip service to cause of federalism and cause of Madhesi people? But attempt was attempt was made to carve out provinces that do not give them real political power.
Well, I would say it's little more than lip service because by making the federal states, you have given right to the people living there. Now, people living there are demographically mixed because during Mahindra's time, during monarchy's time, many of the hill people were brought into Madhesh and got settled there. So they are also having their own rights. And in any democracy, you cannot discriminate that you have come from place X, therefore you have no right here. So to that extent, yes, it is true that the federal structure which the Madhesh people wanted has not been granted, has not been achieved. No doubt about that. But the fact that firstly a centralized constitution has become a federal constitution, number one. Number two, the federating states are having their own governments with the dominance of the dominant parties nonetheless. But at the same time, it has given little more voice to the local people, to the Madesh. Therefore, as I said, it is not a full satisfaction of the aspirations of the people, but in a way, it has opened the gate. And once you open a gate in democracy, once people become far more assertive and far more, unfortunately, one of the reasons is that the Madesh parties are not united. They also, for the sake of power, are willing to make all kind of equations with anyone for very temporary and short-term gains. Now, if they do this, then they are also mutilating the long-term objectives. They are also mutilating the element of inclusiveness for their own narrow interest of the leadership and the elite. So yes, there are problems at every stage. And therefore, we must understand this as a process of evolution, that in the process of evolution, once you open the gate, there would be a crowd rushing through. There would be many who would be crushed and would not be able to make it. But eventually, the opening of the door is good for the system.
So Nepal, as you mentioned, has a youth bulge and people are aspiring to achieve higher standards and all, and they're leaving actually the country. It's a two-edged sword. One is that they are going outside, they are making good money, they are sending remittances. But on the other hand, the country is losing its brain power and youth power. Isn't that reflective of the inadequacies of the current political system that cannot harness its youth energy and cannot focus on national development?
No, that is also, I mean, I would agree with you so far as the thrust of your question is concerned. But what, I would put it this way, that even a developed, I mean, relatively more developed country, India is sending people out. Migration is a part of Asian culture of work. And there are very few Asian countries where people there are fully satisfied, except, say, a country like Singapore or something. Even from China, people are going out with all this development which is there because there are not enough freedoms in one way or the other. So that is a curse of long-standing poverty, long-standing deprivation which is there. And since these people are now educated, I have seen a difference in the people who are getting educated in India from Nepal, and now those who are getting educated in Australia, in Germany, in US, in Britain, in Canada, anywhere else, in China and Russia also. So there is a shift in this sense, and I think that is a phenomenon which apply to most of the developing countries. And I would not blame Nepal for that, unfortunately. the conditions are not very attractive at home and therefore people do leave. But this is a phenomenon we must keep in a broader context. Secondly, the development is also taking place. Take, for instance, the hydropower sector. The hydropower sector, they barely produced 600 megawatts of power earlier. Now they have hit nearly 2,000 or little more than 1,000, and they are going on. And they have now an agreement of selling 10,000 megawatts to India, which will earn them a lot of revenue in the coming 5 years. So hydropower sector has been, in a way privatized. That is, it is in the open market that you go and do that. And I think it did deliver. Secondly, a lot of infrastructure is being emphasized now. It is being built by other countries, like partly India, a great deal of China also is doing it. Now, if infrastructure is built up, then the tourism sector would open up. And if the tourism sector opens up, that would also be a revenue earning source for Nepal. So I see there are issues which are quite potentially attractive in terms of opening up. You're right, much would depend upon what the governmental direction is, what the policies are, how stable they are. So yes, there are a lot of question marks hanging over it. But I think we should, as I said earlier, it is better to be hopeful that in future some sense would prevail even on the rulers. If the sense does not prevail, they would be under pressure of the public. People will throw them out. People are throwing them out. There is a new elite section which is coming up. There is a new leadership which is being elected by the people. And I think that is the kind of, the press is open. Press is coming out on corruption stories, coming out on inefficient rulers, inefficient ministers, corrupt ministers. I think this is a popular pressure which would be built up, and the movement will be slow. There are many hurdles, but I think its direction should be positive. At least this is what I hope, since I have always looked at Nepal as my second home.
So you're very hopeful that...
Not very hopeful. I'm very cautiously hopeful.
Okay, that Nepal is in the right path with democracy being enshrined in day-to-day life. It's a matter of time.
I pray it must shrine. I'm not fully satisfied with the functioning of the democracy. I must be very clear. But, there is a ray of hope with which I am looking at Nepal.
So in Nepalese politics, it has been almost fashionable to blame somebody else for their shortcomings. Initially, it was the monarchical system. Also, it was the big brother. What is holding them back now? The monarchy is gone. The influence.
No, well, there are, it's still a, what you call a country in flux. There are still many people who are asking for the monarchy to be revived. I don't see any chance of that, because those who are in power today would never like to share their power with anyone else, if for nothing else. Secondly, the aspirations of the people have now absolutely, completely exploded. And it would be very difficult to contain them in one way or the other. Third is, monarchy did not do anything. Monarchy was in Nepal for 250 years. I think it is monarchy inefficiency which led to the Maoist revolution. Because in the areas, Rolpa, Dolpa, these are the areas which are utterly poor, utterly underdeveloped, and utterly neglected. So I don't see much virtue, though there are some people arguing it that, look, this instability, therefore monarch was a better stable. I mean, look at the monarchy, the way massacre has taken place in Nepal. 2 massacres. One was in the 19th century, the other one was very recently, in 2001. So I don't see a revival of monarchy. There are some people who are also wanting a Hindu state, which again, I think Nepal is a Hindu society. But my submission to many of my Nepali friends is that if a state acquires a sectarian identity, either of religion, either of ethnicity, either of language, that state would tear itself internally. Because we Asian societies are all diverse societies. And in diverse society, if you emphasize one section, no matter how majoritarian it is, others would feel alienated and they would then revolt, causing instability. So I don't see that is another answer to that.
So while looking at possible options of governance, monarchy was one option and a secular democratic republic is another one. There would be a case made by some people that in order to reduce internal strife and to promote stability, Nepal might adopt the British system of constitutional monarchy, where monarch is just a figurehead, but indicate some sort of continuity, some sort of stability, while the executive powers lie with the democratically elected prime minister. So rather than having either or situation, you might have a middle way, that way you satisfy democratic aspirations and have some symbolic state significance for the monarchy. Any ideas or comments on that?
Well, that's the expectation which Nepalis had, which India had, at least from 1950 onwards. You know, from 1857, Nepal was being ruled by the Ranas, which
Yes.
was a different kind of an aristocracy, and king was a figurehead. Not only a figurehead, it was a subordinate head. It had to do whatever the Ranas wanted. After the overthrow of the Ranas, the Nepalese and we in India also expected that Nepal would now have, as you are saying, a British model of constitutional monarchy, in which monarch would be a figurehead, but a sense of direction it would give, and then the democracy would flourish. The experience of the last 40, 50 years, 70 years, I would say, clearly underlines that the monarchy in Nepal was not willing to take the role of a constitutional monarchy. King Mahendra, after King Tribhuvan, which was in 54, 55, King Mahendra dismissed the first elected government, imposed a panchayat system. That panchayat system was changed in 1990, and the king again demonstrated a coup and took over all the central powers by Gyanendra. Even when Virendra wanted to do something, his royal family, particularly his brother and his wife, would not let him do anything. So my reading of the Nepali situation is that the DNA of a constitutional monarchy is not there in the kings of Nepal. And therefore, the ruling royal families would not function as a constitutional monarch. And if they had functioned as a constitutional monarch, history and development of Nepal would be very different. So I have my own very strong reservations if a constitutional monarchy can develop. And now that the people who have become prime ministers and deputy ministers and state ministers and governors and whatnot, why would they leave their power and hand it over to the king, one person, and function at his discretion? Except for those who have vested interest in monarchy or in the king's rule, which is a minuscule minority, which clearly is underlined in every election. There is a party which talks about the monarchy's revival, and that party hardly gets any sizable votes, which shows the preference of the people. Therefore, I have a feeling, and that party is also talking about constitutional monarchy, by the way. They are not talking about absolutist or authoritarian monarchy. And that's not working. So my humble submission is that I find it very hard for Nepal to revive monarchy, to make it constitutional, and then still progress and develop.
Well, the world has moved quite a long way. Even in UK, there is a Republican movement.
Louder.
there is a Republican movement even in UK, and people want to even eliminate monarchy there also. So we are not living in an era of monarchies and absolute rulers, but the travesty is that you had absolute power by the Rana dynasty. Then when the Rana dynasty's wings were clipped, absolute power by monarchy, and now you have absolute power by corrupt provincial, you know, uh, politicians who are after short-term gains. So you do not have any kind of semblance of integrity in any of the ruling systems in Nepal at this point in time.
No, Dr. Adityanjee, I tell you that, after monarchy, I must bring one aspect to your viewers' attention. That even with the Maoist revolution, the Maoists wanted to negotiate with the king. And at one stage, they offered them a cultural constitutional monarchy if they can settle it. There were negotiations between monarchy and the Maoist. And the king refused to do that. Now, even that was the best. Then secondly, I on the basis of my research, the Indian Prime Minister, in his 3 talks, thrice one-to-one negotiations on different occasions, requested the king to take the political parties on the board, and then we will all together resist the Maoist insurgency. The king will say, okay, I will do it, go back to Kathmandu and back to square one. He did not do anything. That is the reason why the system changed. And that's the reason that those who were monarchists earlier later on turned against him. In fact, all political parties almost unanimously agreed to remove the monarchy. There was no resistance to this proposal in the Constituent Assembly in the interim situation. After 2008 elections, this was the first thing that the Constituent Assembly approved and supported. So I don't go with that it is really possible to have it, no matter which power wants it. I know there are sections in India who would want, because they find it very difficult to meet the Chinese challenge in Nepal. And they say there are 2 easy answers. One is have a Hindu state so that the Chinese communist influence would not be there. And then secondly, have a monarchy. So you have to deal with only one person in terms of your critical decisions, and you can fight. I think these are very unrealistic propositions because, religion, the Chinese are not playing the religious card at all. The Chinese are playing the economic card. And unless you meet them economically, you can't compete with them.
So what is the role of Chinese Communist Party in running the Nepalese government and Nepalese system at this juncture?
What senses?
What is the influence of Chinese Communist Party in
Nepal?
In Nepal at this juncture? Because a lot has been talked about KP Sharma Oli's ties with the Chinese government and his overt preference for Chinese policies.
Chinese would very much want to do that. They would want to consolidate the communist parties of Nepal together. But let me tell you that the Nepalese communists are Pashupatinath going communists. Pashupatinath going communist means if you think they are ideologically very hard, you are mistaken totally. They will do anything for power. You see the present alliance between Nepali Congress and the UML. On which ideological platform you can explain it? We saw the alliance between the Maoist and the Nepali the Nepali Congress Party. And in earlier alliances, the monarchists are also involved. The independents are also, Swatantra Party is also involved. Don't be misguided by ideological parameters so far as Nepali politics is concerned. The Chinese would want to have a consolidation of the communist parties in the hope that communist parties would deliver them their agenda. Forget about that. Simply forget. I mean, we must go back into the history and see that the Maoists who called themselves identified to the Chinese leader were chased out by the Chinese and they took shelter in India. There was no ideological support for them. The Chinese at that time were going forward in supporting the monarchy to crush the Maoists. And they issued a statement saying that the Maoists are opportunists, they are misusing the name of our leaders, this and that. So the ideological parameters can work to some extent. It is a simple question of power and influence. Even when you look at the Chinese efforts, the Chinese, as I said, yes, they have tried to bring the communist parties together, but they have not been able to. Even the Chinese Central Party, Communist Central Party delegations came and tried their best, and nothing happened. If at all it has happened, it was temporary. It was just a kind of an ad hoc arrangement.
So Nepal is one of the countries that is participant in the China's BRI project, Border Road Initiative project. And there have been a number of infrastructures that have been developed as part of the BRI. How significant that is, because the criticism of BRI is that it's a debt trap. Other countries like Sri Lanka and Malaysia and Asia have renegotiated and actually cancelled some of the BRI projects. What's the situation in Nepal versus vis-a-vis BRI projects?
Well, so far as Nepal is concerned, you know, the BRI agreement was signed in 2017. First memorandum of understanding. And mind it, that was done in the background of Mr. Oli seeking the Chinese support as a counterweight to political pressure on him from India, what he felt. It was largely done to balance alienation from India. After signing 2017 agreement, 2019, even Xi Jinping visited Nepal. And they wanted to have a protocol for implementation and all that. Till date, the implementation protocol has not been signed. In between, the Nepalese told the Chinese that we will accept your proposals and projects, provided you give us grants, not loans. The Chinese are not willing to convert their loans into grants. Therefore, nothing is proceeding further so far. This is concerned. Then, so far as BRI is concerned, under the BRI, there are so many projects which are economically not viable, which have been taken up. I give you an example. They have proposed a train link between Lhasa and Kathmandu.
Yes.
And which can even go to the bordering. 80% of that train in the feasibility report, which has come so far, would be passing under the tunnel. Now, 80% of the trek is under tunnel. Where are the stations and where are the passengers? And the cost of it. And you would know that BRI has been hotly debated within China for President Xi Jinping's uneconomical proposals. Therefore, many road proposals, even in case of Pakistan, there have been objections. You mentioned Sri Lanka's name. The best country for BRI in South Asia is Pakistan, where billions of dollars have been sunk over there. And there is a huge protest and reservation from sections in Pakistan against the BRI. So yes, the Chinese are working BRI. Chinese have their own reasons for having BRI. Chinese would want to come into South Asia. I have different set of explanations for that. I don't think we have time for that. And if that happens, how viable the projects undertaken are. I mean, even in Sri Lanka, I tell you, they have taken the Colombo Port City project. You know, they have claimed the land and created a whole new city there. They have built buildings in the hope that the international businesses would come and occupy those buildings and give revenues to the Sri Lankans and to the Chinese. It's not happening. The buildings are lying unused. That is a Hambantota, a port which is still not commercially viable. They built an airport in Matara, in Sri Lanka, which was not economically viable. There are so many such proposals, and therefore the enthusiasm for BRI, which offers you easy money, but not necessarily, smooth money, which you can work with. There are reservations all over in South Asia. And Nepal is a clear example of that.
So coming back to Nepal, Chinese built this international airport in Pokhara.
Yes,
What
that was
is
before BRI. They wanted to make it a part of BRI later on. And Nepalese have said no. They have expressed their desire, no, it is not there. And Pokhara airport is also not working because it has no other links. India has put its foot down that you can't fly to Pokhara through Indian territory.
It's underutilized, definitely. And India has its own reasons not to allow.
Well, I don't quite approve them, but yes, Government of India has its own reasons not to encourage and not to consolidate the Chinese presence in Nepal.
So Pokhara airport was built by grants or by loans?
No, it was by loan.
By loans.
Loan also, their rates of loan are 2 to 2.5%, whereas the IMF and other loans are at 1.5%. So there is a difference in the interest which is being charged. And Nepal has raised this issue, Sri Lanka raised this issue.
So looks like there is some realism in the rulers of Nepal at this point in time about BRI.
Well, on BRI, there are reservations. And BRI has not proceeded so far. And even now they are negotiating. The Chinese are putting a lot of pressure for adopting a protocol for implementing the BRI projects. The Nepalese are struck on two things. Number one, the loans and grant issue. And secondly, what benefit it will give to Nepal. So if you have a rail track which doesn't take your passengers, which does not take your load, how much the Chinese train will be able to take Nepalese to Lhasa? They can bring people from Lhasa to Nepal. And there's a very funny story about it because there are about 11 or 12 exit points between Nepal and Tibet. And they are all governed by the Chinese side. The Chinese had blocked all the doors. They allowed one-way traffic whenever they wanted to come. Now they have, I think, last meeting when the Nepalese foreign minister went there, they have agreed to open all the dates. But many of those people living in the upper Himalayan region used to depend on consumer goods from Tibet. But since they blocked the roads, they are facing a lot of difficulties there. Because getting things from Kathmandu and others would be far more expensive for them. So there are problems there also.
So Nepal seems to be stumbling along in certain ways, trying to balance both China and India against each other. That issue comes up all the time. And the feeling at this point in time is that whether it was Prachanda or KP Sharma Oli, both have tried to play China card against India at various times. I know you have very strong views on that, but we would like our viewers to know your views on this Nepal playing the China card against India.
Well, yes, I mean, he tried to, and not only he, I would say even King Mahendra tried to do that. And almost all rulers who come to power, because they have a problem with India, and I use this sentence, they are still not very sure how close to India is not too close. So they want to have equations with India, but the question of identity comes in, the question of dependence comes in, and they have problems. So they will play the balancing power, but the reality is different. And I'll tell you what the reality is. For instance, in my understanding, Oli signed transit agreements and access to Chinese ports.
Yes.
That was signed in 2018.
Yes.
6 years later, there were only 2 cargoes which went through the Chinese ports from Nepal. If you want to get petrol, they had a petrol crisis because of the blockade from India. And if you start a tanker somewhere in China and come to Kathmandu, the tanker would be empty before it reaches Kathmandu. So there's no oil to be delivered. The distance, the geography dictates it. Besides, there is a question of culture and civilization. There is a question of language. People don't understand this language. There is a question of relationship. There are so many Nepalese in Tarai, in Uttaranchal, in Sikkim side are married to the Indian side, and vice versa. You have no such relationship with China. And it cannot be. Because China, all said and done, the Tibet comes in between as a buffer. Socially, culturally, civilizationally, politically, you may have a control over it. So this kind of balancing game doesn't really work. My friend Baburam Bhattrai, when he was Prime Minister, he said Nepal would like to be a bridge between China and India. Then I asked him, are you sure that both India and China want a bridge? They have their own trade relations going on, $100 billion between India and China. Why do they need any bridge if they want to increase this trade? So yes, from Kathmandu, it looks a very attractive proposal. And there are many Nepalese who are married to this kind of a proposal that we will play, and this is natural, every country plays it. India plays it today for instance, between Russia and America. There is a balancing game, all said and done, despite very close relationship with the US over last 2 decades. So you have this politically, yes, the transit agreements were a political statement, not an economic statement. That politically we want to be less dependent on India. But can this dependence be replaced by China? No. First is yes. So, this kind of a dilemma continues to haunt Nepali policymakers.
While playing the balancing game, the Nepalese government banned the recruitment of Nepalese citizens in the Agnipath scheme. Do you think that will encourage Nepali youth to enroll and enlist in the PLA as a counterbalance? And if that were to happen, Nepalese government will countenance such activities?
Well, China would love to have that. Why not? The Russians are having Nepalese to fight for them in Ukraine. Any other country, who would not like mercenaries, tell me? Therefore, the Chinese would love to have it. And some of the needy Nepalese may be attracted to them. But that kind of a bond, a strategic security bond, to what extent Nepali state would like to have with China is a big question mark. In fact, even their bond with India, they had raised questions. The Maoists had raised questions. The communists had raised questions that terminate Gorkha Treaty. We don't want any more people to go and serve in the Gorkha. Because of economic compulsions, the arrangement continues. But that kind of a bond with China, I don't know. I keep my fingers crossed. I mean, in absolute sense, nobody can say anything. As I said, the Nepalese have gone and fought for the Russians in Ukraine. And Nepalese have gone and fought for the UN in various other parts of the countries. Indians have gone and fought for that. So that is possible. But I don't think a bond of that type, of security type, relationship type, which we had between India and Nepal, and even Nepal and the UK, a Gorkha bond can happen with China.
Okay. So coming towards the end of this conversation, what do you envisage the future of Nepal politically, let's say in 10 years' time, 20 years' time? What are your
I
predictions?
think coming 10 years, there will be continued political turbulence in Nepal. But at the same time, I do see an incremental economic growth and progress in Nepal, and an incremental opening of the political space in Nepal, and inclusion of people who are at the time marginalized. It takes years. I mean, India's wonderful constitution did not integrate Dalits till now. And therefore, it will take time in Nepal, maybe 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, or maybe more. But the coming 10 years, I can continue to see this turbulence and this confusion which is there. But I hope that, as I said in the beginning, that it would be in a positive direction. Economically, Nepal will grow. I have no doubt about it. Nepal will become more confident. Nepal will be able to think of its own interest, wider national interest, in a broader sense in a democratic system. Though some of the leaders will continue to pollute it because of their own aspirations of grabbing power and retaining it, of distributing patronage and having their own little constituencies here and there. But this drama for the coming 10 years will continue. I see no relenting in that sense.
Do you envisage any restructuring of the provinces, 7 provinces, into more rational, more, to satisfy the regional aspirations of Janjatis as well as the Madhesi people?
Well, they'll try to do that. Constitutionally, for instance, they ask for, I think, 30% or even more representation of women. Practically, it has not taken place. So, you look at the political structures. On the one hand, you have a document which defines the direction in which you are going. On the other hand, you have a political reality which falls far short of the defined direction. And this gap is inevitable. And I don't think Nepal would be an exception to fill this gap very fast or very soon. Therefore, there may be a little more opening up of the marginalized communities, both the tribal groups and Madhesh, politically more assertive. They would be, but it will be a very, very slow and incremental process. I don't see any major transformation in this soon enough.
Do you possibly envisage or see jettisoning of the India-Nepal Friendship Treaty of 1951 in near future?
No, I think India-Nepal relations are also plagued with all kinds of hurdles and problems. And I have told you the Nepali dilemma is how close to India is not too close. And they have to have a national consensus in what kind of a relationship you want to have with India. In any bilateral relationship, you have to be sensitive to the interest of both the sides. The Nepalese simply can't say that we want this, but we won't concede on that. That will not happen. On India's side, I would say India needs to understand that there is a new Nepal. There is a Nepal which is more confident, a Nepal which is more aspirant, a Nepal which is growing, which is different. There is a lot of youth people who don't go into the old Hindu state and roti beti ka sambandh and all that. It has of very limited value, not much value. And Indian policymakers will have to be far more sensitive to Nepal's demands and aspirations than they have been in the past. So if these correctives are there, maybe relationship would be smooth. But the bond between the two are very deep, and the countries would jostle around, I would say.
Talking about Nepalese demands, sometimes Nepalese demands are perceived as unreasonable in India. And one of the examples would be the border dispute over Kalapani.
Yes.
Do you have any views on that?
Well, my views on that I have explained in writings many ways. Both India and Nepal have their own documents on that dispute. The Indians have been in the physical possession of that all these years, for centuries. The Nepalese have not been. That was a Kailash Mansarovar route for India, and they have used it. That is a route which has been accepted by China as the trade route between India and China also. Therefore, India has its own solid proofs with them. Nepalese have their own solid proofs with them going back to the Sagoli Treaty and some of the revenue papers which they collected the revenue of some time. My submission would be that they should sit down on the table and weigh their documents. Which one weighs heavier? May their own claims, which one weighs heavier, and the thing should tilt over there. If that is not possible, there are other options to do this. One option is to have a shared sovereignty, because Nepal and India are free to move between each other. You know, the border technically, legally does not exist. So the Nepalese can go and develop in the Limpuadhura area. The Indians can continue to use the way they are using it there. And both of them, the joint sovereignty is an international legal concept. And you can always take it there. The third one is that find a third party which can come and mediate between you. Maybe SARC solution, maybe some mutually agreed person. And if that is not there, go to the International Court of Justice. In fact, India had gone on Bangladesh, maritime boundary, they had gone over there. And lastly, there is also a possibility of swapping of territories. You know, there is another dispute in Susta area, in which India is in the possession of the territory which the Nepalese claim. And if India gives that territory to Nepal, Nepal must give up its claims on the Limpuadhura. So there are possibilities of resolving it by sitting on the table. By unilateral decisions which only wanted to do it, there is no way out anywhere else. He had the constitutional amendment, he had the map being printed, he now has done it on 100 rupee note. That is not going to help.
And it is stated that such recent burst of activities are to embarrass India at the directions of CCP.
Say it again, please.
This recent burst of anti-India sentiments is at the behest of Chinese Communist Party.
Sense of?
Chinese Communist Party. This is
well,
embarrassing.
If I got your question correctly, my view is that India has to set its China policy correctly. There's no point in getting unhappy with Nepal for their relations with China. BRI is accepted today by all of India's neighbors. And tomorrow, if Bhutan establishes diplomatic relations with China, I'm sure the Bhutanese would also go and accept the BRI. The whole world has accepted, except India. So they will seek their advantage wherever it is. The problem is that India has to balance its policy vis-a-vis China by national power and by dealing with China separately.
So that Nepal does not get the maneuverability to play.
So nobody, not only Nepal, either Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Maldives or even Afghanistan, they don't take an undue advantage of that rivalry which is there. So I think India has to approach China from that perspective, that we should not let our tensions be exploited by others. But as I mentioned earlier, China has its own stakes in South Asia, and China would be there in South Asia. India has to tailor its policy to adjust with them and see what countermeasures it can take.
Well, let's hope that Nepal continues on the path of aspirational development and rational policies. And in that process, there is just some feelings or ambivalence towards India, not play it unduly to the extent that Nepalese society damages its own interests. Nepal lost 1,000 workers in Qatar.
Sometimes I compare India-Nepal relations with the soap opera in India between Saas Bahu relationship. They will fight for few hours, and they will settle for few hours again.
Now, the
And they
point
have
I,
to live in the same family. There is no other alternative for either of them.
yeah, the point I was making that, 1,000 Nepalese youth lost their lives in this Qatar and build up to the, FIFA.
1,000 Nepalese lost their lives in?
Qatar
Yes.
in 2022 while building up those
Yeah, yeah.
stadiums and infrastructure. Similarly, Nepalese youth are fighting in Ukraine on behest of Russia. And at the same time, Nepalese government is banning Nepalese citizens to enroll in Agniveer scheme. So that tells you about the priorities of the ruling elite in Nepal, that they're willing to actually damage the interests of their own people rather
Yes.
than let a benign country like India provide some outlets.
But that's a disease, Dr. Adityanjee, of every regime, I would say. I mean, this is, we should not blame the Nepalese alone. Mr. Xi Jinping would not make compromise on his power, and I think Prime Minister Modi would not make compromise on his power. And anywhere else.
Professor Muni, there's a saying in Hindi that you are cutting your nose to spite your face.
Yes, yes, they do it.
My hope is
They
that
do it.
Nepal's future rulers, whether they are democratic or not democratic, whether communist or not communist,
Yes.
centrist, they should not damage the interests of Nepalese people, like the wanton, damage to Nepalese youth that happens, exploitation that is happening. That
I
needs.
fully agree with you. I fully agree with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Muni.
My pleasure, sir.
This was the first time you came on our platform, and
Yeah,
I can assure you this would not be the last. We will get you back on our platform.
Pleasure to talk to you.
Forums. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Namaste.
you.